Welcome to the Mindful Healers podcast with Dr. Jessie Mahoney
and Dr. Ni-Cheng.
We are physicians and leaders who are also trained in coaching, yoga, mindfulness, and integrative medicine.
We are also mothers, spouses, sisters, daughters, aunts, and friends.
In this podcast, we share candid, heart-centered, loving, science-based, thoughtful, and often fun conversations about the challenges life throws at us.
With our collective experience of over 30 years in physician and personal wellness, we reflect and offer pearls of wisdom for navigating life's challenges with more ease.
From parenting, marriages, money scarcity, cancer survivorship, uncertainty, challenges in practicing medicine, we cover it all.
We invite you to refresh your perspective and empower yourself with mindset, mindfulness, and other well-being tools that actually work. A quick reminder that nothing in our podcast is medical advice.
Welcome to What to Do When You Are Off Balance.
The inspiration for this episode comes from my off-kilter, off-balance week this week. And we hope it is helpful and entertaining to hear a bit more about the process and the experience.
Our intention is to normalize that being off balance or off kilter from a mental perspective is part of the human experience, at least some of the time. But with mindfulness and self-compassion, you might discover causes of feeling off kilter and ways to realign.
And takeaways of the episode, my hope in sharing it is to be vulnerable and honor my own humanness so that hopefully more of you will be able to honor your own humanness. To remember that we don't need to fix things in the moment, that it's all part of this natural course of being a human being. And best of all, to offer some helpful and fun invitations to help you realign and to help you find your footing before you fall down the stairs like I did.
So inviting you now into a settling practice. If it's safe for you to do so, inviting you to close your eyes or lower your gaze a few inches in front of you. It's noticing the support of ground or a chair, whatever you might be standing or sitting on for this moment. Leaving everything that came before at the door. Giving yourself full permission to arrive, to simply be open in listening, getting curious about how this episode applies to you. And as you're ready, blinking open eyes, letting the light back in. So we thought that this episode would be fun and helpful to structure it in such a way where I would be using mindful inquiry as a means to explore Jessie's experience of her off-kilter week. So let's just begin by setting the stage, Jessie. What happened?
Interesting, because when I think about what happened, part of the off-kilterness is not knowing what happened, is just feeling off-kilter or feeling off balance. And I think a huge part of me making the more struggle about the struggle was trying to explain it and say, why do I feel off-kilter? What happened that makes me feel this way? And what do I need to do to fix it? And so what I can share is that on Sunday, I just felt off is the word. I wouldn't even say off kilter at that point, just off. And my brain gave the explanation that I was tired from several busy weeks. And if I just rest, I'll feel better. But that didn't seem to be the answer. And it was more of a vague sense of unrest, like the unsettled and nothing just feeling quite right. So not so much angsty and twitchy, but just things just don't feel quite right. And I think the other thing that came to mind is that I'm sort of acutely aware of the body sensations. I recently took a course on yoga and the nervous system and somatics, and sort of understanding how most of our cues come from our body. So I also wonder if my brain was primed to notice how my body felt off and really be aware of that.
And so, speaking of body sensations, it seems like that was a huge clue as to your labeling your direct experience as being off kilter through acknowledging what your body sensations were. Can you take us through that? And then through the honoring the system of mindful inquiry, also taking us through your thoughts about it and also the emotions that were arising for you?
So I think the body sense was, it's funny because the word I'm going to use is actually an emotion, but irritability, but at the body level, like things just sort of being cranky or speaking up, not pain per se, but just discomfort. And I hear my brain offering that I should be able to tell you, oh, it was in my throat, or oh, it was in my belly. And I don't know is the answer. Although I actually wonder, when you were doing that settling practice, I noticed something that I'm going to use the word should, but from kindness. It's like, I bet it would have been helpful for me along the way. And this is something I did not do, is go to someone else's yoga class. Because when I let you start to lead, I could just drop in and it was much easier. And as someone who, you know, does a lot of things on her own and maybe teaches yoga, that's a different space for me to be in. So it was just sort of interesting. I think perhaps if you had done this exercise on Sunday or Monday, I might have had more clarity. But what I felt was just this vague sense of discomfort, and it feels like a physical irritability, if that makes sense. As I'm describing it now, I'm like, it's probably more in my throat and maybe a little bit in my chest. As you know, in coaching, we often talk about describing what it looks like. And so I will say it's this vague, amorphous blob of gray, not light gray, not dark gray, medium gray, and it's not all the same color. And I laugh at that, but I know from my own experience that when you can just describe it that way, it has like this persona, and it makes it a little bit easier to feel it and own it, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it's also, by you describing it, it's also separate from you, right? Like that wasn't your identity. Like you didn't become this gray amorphous multi shades of blob. Like that was just part of your physical irritability. So I think that
we skip ahead to the thoughts, though. My thought was that it was me, and it was not separate from me, and that what was wrong with me, and really that I needed to fix it. And then I think the thoughts that came from that state of emotion, which is also what you were getting at, is the, you know, I'm a little embarrassed to say this, but focusing on all the things that were wrong or negative or needed to be fixed, and lots of unhelpful stories about what wasn't working and what other people should do, you know, and even maybe, you know, what I should be doing differently, but really a strong sense that I should be able to fix it. And then the emotions were really, so irritability for sure, and cranky, and probably a bit of anxiety, I would say. And I don't know if unsettled is an emotion. It's, for me, what's really tricky here is distinguishing the body sensation from the emotion. And because I just took this class, it's so interesting. They actually really say that, you know, they are hard to distinguish. I'm someone who really feels emotions, feels emotions. And part of the reason that mindfulness is helpful for me is to acknowledge that, wow, that I'm just like, this is just big. You know, we talk, I'm a pediatrician. Kids have big emotions. Well, I'm a grown-up that has big emotions. And sort of, it gives me a space of a way to look at them from the outside and not have to fix them, but just let them be. And so there's definitely the cranky, irritation, stressed, and maybe unsettled. And yet I would say those are also the exact same words I use to describe my body sensation. So I don't know if you have thoughts on clarifying that. I'm curious.
Well, I think in someone who is so mindful at baseline and who is already aware, I think it's common to have the body sensations and the emotions blur because you feel your emotions in your body. So it's natural that it would blur.
I love that. And in my course, actually, what they talk about is for many people who haven't explored mindfulness. So for people who are listening who haven't done this work, that we often disregard the emotions and the body and we separate them. So like we have pain, but the pain could be exacerbated by physical emotions, or that many of us were taught not to feel emotions. And so I might have the opposite. I don't want to call it a problem, but I feel them intensely, right? And I don't have a problem with feeling them. But when I feel them, it's like what to do with them. I still want to drop into that mindset of how do I control it or how do I change it? And I have a value judgment about which ones are good and which ones are bad, or maybe even which ones I want to feel and don't.
And the converse is true too, right? It's like some of us were also taught to not pay attention to body sensations and to basically ignore discomfort, to ignore pain until your body is screaming at you. And so I think overall, between body sensations and emotions, which tend to be very uncomfortable when you decide to deny their existence, I think the path to the learning opportunity here is to feel to heal.
Mm-hmm.
Right, we have that that adage of the feeling to heal, and in order to feel, you have to acknowledge both emotions and the body sensations.
And perhaps just acknowledge they're very related and intertwined. And when we disregard one or the other, we're out of balance, which is, of course, what this episode is all about.
And now taking this circle of awareness that we're meandering through with you, Jessie, what about the behaviors? Because I'm sure that some automatic behaviors kind of came up for you. You already shared about the default negative attention bias that came online pretty immediately once you noticed that things were off kilter. So what about the actual actions?
And I will say the unmanaged reactive actions would be not sleeping well. And sort of now I am in that menopausal phase, so I sometimes don't sleep well anyway. So the first night I will often say, oh, it's just that, but not sleeping well for many days. And then just being sort of short and we'll use the word crisp. I'm not as patient and not as sort of buoyant, really. So being more reactive. And the other one I'll say is distracted or careless, as we're going to talk about that, what happened coming up. And another thought that comes to mind, I was thinking about this actually, is potentially needing to be its own podcast, but reckless is something that came up. And it's not intentionally reckless, but I think sometimes when we're out of, I tend to be more careful or thoughtful or deliberate. And so reckless would be stirring up dust. It reminds me a bit of a teenager, right? Who's a little bit reactive and reckless. And maybe my lack of care walking down the stairs was reckless in that same sense. If I'm thinking about behaviors, I'm not like driving a car, dangerously, but thinking just sort of generally my behaviors are more reactive.
Mm-hmm. And that reactivity is often tied into recklessness too. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in reflecting in all this detail, thank you for going through this exercise. Why do you think you were feeling the way you were?
And my first answer was that I don't know. It's always my first answer. It's almost like I have to say it before I can look deeper. So one thought is I was kind of depleted, and that was my first, like, I must be tired type of thing. Maybe just, as many people know, I've been through a lot of change, but it also feels like this is cyclical in the sense that I have periods of unrest or unsettled, and they're actually part of how I move through the world. And every time I'm surprised and every time I don't like them. And we already did a podcast on a down day, when this is different than a down day per se, but it's similar that in this, just like you have time periods where you feel great, you also have time periods where you don't. And I think, so if I'm really thinking about the cycle, I don't know that there's one thing that triggered me or one thing that bothered me. In fact, one of the things I like the least about it is I don't know the trigger, because I'm like, oh, if I knew the trigger, then I could prevent it. And yet I have a very strong intuitive sense that, nope, this is just how humanness roles. I know several people, including you, mentioned the moon. And several people mentioned to me this thought of somehow in menopause, when we don't have a menstrual cycle, somehow we're more tied to the moon. This is not something I know anything about, but I like thinking about it in that way. When something's out of your control, at least you can say, oh, it's the moon. It makes you feel a little bit less like there's something wrong with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there was this Aries supermoon and recent comet, and then apparently there's like a small second moon that's orbiting us. So like, I can't help but wonder if any of that could have had something to do with this off-kilterness. And the other aspect of it is using celestial bodies is sometimes helpful to acknowledge the fact that like there are definitely things like planetary alignments and other celestial occurrences that we cannot control. And why not on Earth as well?
Yeah. Well, and I think letting go of the ability to control it is helpful. Like, you can't make it go away, as my human brain wanted to make it go away every day. Could it go away? Has it gone away yet?
Right. And the fact is that you don't know what caused it, what like the trigger was, and that's okay. But it seems like there was some resistance.
Absolutely. Well, and then once you feel off kilter, you start to notice every trigger.
Mm-hmm.
And so then you're like, oh, it's this, or oh, it's this, or oh, it's this thing happened, and this person said this, and maybe that trigger. Like, you start to try to look for causes. And so I think for me in this experience is, this is not the first time, just to be clear. We just thought we'd talk about it because it was so many fun conversations happened as a result of it. But to sort of be able to accept it and recognize that it has this cycle, and the cycle includes trying to find triggers.
Yeah, we try to grasp for things that might be within our control to like fix it. When perhaps it's just a phase, similar to a phase of the moon that just has to be moved through. And that's actually what we're going to talk about next, after you share with us what happened next.
Yeah. Well, and what happened next is, to me, the maybe the big learning, because I think I know that it happens, and I know that it's a cycle, and I know that I tend to be more reactive, and I will now say distractible, or just, even if you are feeling off balance physically and emotionally, then you might fall down the stairs. And so what happened was that I was walking down the stairs with my phone in a hurry to solve a problem and being distracted, and I actually completely missed a step and tumbled, to the point I was no longer feeling just unsettled. I was in pain and flat on the floor. And it was, well, helpful and not helpful, in the sense that it really did get me to pause and be like, oh, well, now here you are lying on the floor. What exactly is going on? And I remember one of my first thoughts was like, what hurts? Trying to see, like, and then what works? And it's kind of interesting, like, that paradigm, which I've never thought about it in that way, of is what hurts is not just, oh, my ankle hurt and my wrist hurt, which they did, and my arm hurt. But it kind of made me start to think bigger, like what's hurting, or what's like, and what's working and what's hurting, and kind of this idea of more of a global perspective, that maybe when something like this happens, you're supposed to pause, and you're clearly supposed to move a little bit more slowly because you're feeling off balance. And so while we want to react, and that's our inner reaction, the piece of being aware and moving more slowly and more carefully, treating yourself with care is what comes to mind, rather than ignoring it and trying to just move through.
yeah, like muscling through the day, feeling off kilter.
You might fall downstairs at the end of the day.
So thank you for being vulnerable and just sharing in greater detail and reflecting with me in real time. I want for you, dear listener, to just plug in a mental health reminder. While it's okay to have some down days and some off kilter days, and of course, a string of them in a row if there is some situational occurrence, such as like grief or some sort of pretty intense event that happened where you can delineate that there was a clear trigger. I want to also remind everyone that getting help helps, and that if you are experiencing more down days or more off kilter days than good days, then here is your invitation to go get checked out. Like, lean on your healthcare team and make sure that physiologically things are working to the best of their ability, because it could be something as easy as an electrolyte imbalance, a vitamin deficiency, or imbalanced chemicals in the brain. So yeah, getting help helps. And so that's my plug for just the awareness of that.
And I think sometimes we don't know whether to trust ourselves, especially when we're feeling unsettled. And so one of the tools that we were going to talk about is helpful. I feel called to bring it up now, which is call a friend. Because I had told you many times that I was just having this off kilter week. You wanted me to decide something. And I was like, nope, not now, because I'm off kilter. But then by checking in with you, and you actually kept checking in with me, how are you feeling, right? That I think you would have told me if you thought like, this is just really not okay. And so having someone else be there as sort of your support person, and maybe not someone who's like in your inner circle, who's like watching it, but someone who's sort of from afar, who knows you. If you have that person out there, I think that not only can they give you support, but they might also be able to give you a fresh perspective. Because you might have said to me, this is the 49th time you've mentioned this. Maybe you want to go talk to someone else besides me about this. And I trust that you would do that. So
yeah, absolutely. So we are happy to report that Dr. Jessie Mahoney is able to ambulate and to transfer from landing to staircase and continue to ascend and descend stairs without, as far as we know, a broken bone right now.
Yeah.
So
I'm tender.
Yeah, so that's how you're doing now. Yeah. I think maybe even beyond physically too. There's maybe still some like tenderness from a spirit and mind perspective as well.
Yeah. So I thought we'd talk a little bit about what was helpful, because there were some fun things that I started to think about. Oh, well, what was helpful and what did I try? And maybe even what did I not try that I wish I had tried is also coming to mind. And so always for me, sunshine is helpful. And so I actually did try this week, like when I noticed it was sunny and I had a break, I actually went outside and like let the warm sunshine be on my face. And I think that can help us ground. I also did a lot of gardening, and my tomato bushes actually were really helpful because they smell really potent. So it's not just like the standing there and picking them, but like you can't but notice that you're just engulfed in smell. And it's a bit of, I would say it's probably mindful harvesting, but either way, and picking even, I've also been picking persimmons, which is very interesting because it's different than the tomatoes, and you have to pull. And you have to and so there's like pull and release, which feels good. It reminds me of some of the yoga things where we like hold things and release, or breath work where you hold and release. And so interestingly, sometimes when you feel off kilter, it's hard to sit on your mat or it's hard to focus on the breath. And so doing something for me physical felt really good, like picking and chopping and doing things like that. And music is another one. I think music can take us outside of ourselves. And so just put it on, and you might not like what you usually like. It would be the other thing I'll say when you're off kilter, but let your body and senses tell you what you like. For me, yoga always makes me feel better. It's why I teach yoga, and it's my friend. And while it's easier, I think, for me to teach in this moment in the future, after I mentioned earlier, I would probably also go to someone else's yoga class, and probably not online, assuming we weren't having a pandemic. I would go in person, because I think that that energetic exchange there might have helped me find my grounding before I fell down the stairs.
Speaking of grounding, even just walking outside, so combining some of these modalities, right? So the sunshine plus the nature plus physical activity. So it's like a 3-for-1. Might literally be a very direct and accessible route for you to tether back to the ground.
And I think to notice there, are you does fast walking make you ground and help you release stuff? Or do you want to be slow walking and pausing and stopping and breathing, and just maybe even on your walk, test them out and see which one feels better?
Plug for forest bathing podcast.
Yeah. Well, at this moment, I'm slow walking, because it was a rude awakening to fall, because now I can't. I was like, I should go hike a mountain. And I have used that in the past when I felt unsettled, but I won't be doing that now. So then sort of figuring out, well, what other tools are out there? And you mentioned Feel to Heal and Name to Tame, which I also just wanted to throw out those two acronyms, which to me feel helpful. And I think when I named and acknowledged what was going on, I felt much better. Gave me back a little bit of a sense of control. Oh, this is one of those unsettled weeks, or this is one of those. It was funny, because we have a previous podcast about a down day, and I was like, this is not a down day. This is something different. And so even sort of toggling against what it is and how would you describe it, for me, was really helpful.
So the name to tame it, physiologically, it can help disarm the amygdala from spiraling into fight or flight. That is what it helps to do.
And then I think some of I will call it not fun, but helpful, is being patient and recognizing that it has to run its course. It will run its course. You don't feel unsettled forever, though when you feel unsettled, you feel like it's forever. And sometimes this being can be helpful, not trying to do something. I think that depends on you and depends on the situation, because sometimes the being makes it harder. And if it were triggered by some particular event, the being might actually not be helpful. We've often talked about how sometimes mindfulness can make the experience of trauma not be helpful in that scenario. And that's outside of the purview of this podcast, but just trying them out and seeing which one it is. I also wanted to mention self-compassion, because, again, embarrassed to share this, but I like to be vulnerable. It didn't occur to me until about day 3 that would be a good practice, even though I do a lot of hand to heart, like really recognizing I went through this, like, oh, you really are doing the best you can. You really are, it doesn't feel good, but that doesn't mean that, there's something wrong or there's something to fix. And having that compassion, Kristen Neff's diet of common humanity and kindness. I know she has mindfulness in there too. And I think we've talked about that enough in this episode, but the kindness to yourself and recognizing your common humanity, and that these unsettled days are part of being human, was really powerful for me this time around. So I feel like I've progressed in the world of self-compassion. I was like, oh yeah, that's what makes you feel better. You should do that. Shauna Shapiro talks about it as a life raft for turbulent times. And while maybe unsettled is not turbulent, I'm going to say it's a life raft for even rough seas, or maybe it's a life preserver for rough seas. And that I found it to be really very helpful, especially for me, hand to heart. And what felt very different and worth reflecting on is I do a ton of hand to heart in yoga, and I do a ton of hand to heart in my coaching work and my retreats, but I'm not doing it in a moment of distress. And when you do it for yourself in a moment of distress, it's completely different. And the experience was completely different. So yes, you need to practice it in not moments of distress. So it's, you know what to do, and it's at the ready, but the physical experience of it in a moment of distress was very powerful.
Mm-hmm. I want to highlight the common humanity. Oftentimes when we are feeling off kilter, we become hyper acute of our direct experience, but like when we broaden the lens and our perspectives to include the rest of the world, I can guarantee you are not the only person on the planet that is facing off kilter at that moment in time. So just to remember the expansiveness of the common human experience and the spectrum of what quote unquote a normal human experience is.
And I want to reflect that while we're throwing out these ideas of things to do when you feel unsettled, someone had asked me to record a podcast on what to do when everything's falling apart. And these things would also be worth trying then as well. You likely would need more support, but this list of tools of things to try when things aren't right or aren't going well could also be worth trying in situations that felt more significant than just being unsettled, as they are tools that could help. Though in that situation, getting help helps as well.
So the two that I wanted to contribute to your list also include getting curious. Mm-hmm. So going through that mental exercise that we just did of getting curious about what your body is feeling, what your emotions are, and naming them, and what your thoughts are around this off-kilter situation, and then reflecting on what actions you're kind of tempted to participate in out of reactivity versus choice and response. So really inviting you to get curious about these off-kilter days, not necessarily to try to find the origins of that and like try to fix that origin, even though sometimes it might just be that simple, but other times we don't know. We don't know why we're feeling somewhat off-kilter in that day, and that's okay. So the curiosity piece. And then the other one we talk about a lot, which is your intention. So like, okay, you have acknowledged and accepted, even though you have not liked, that you are off kilter. So what's next? So how do you want to respond to that? What's the intention that you hope to bring to that response? And so when we were talking about this podcast, the calm and grounded aspiration, I'll say, of one of the retreat participants came up for this particular podcast. And I think that's a really powerful metaphor. If you think about a tree and all of the seasons that it goes through, all of the different challenges that it goes through, from fires to significant variations in temperature to people chopping its branches, pulling on its leaves, uprooting even, it has the capacity to remain calm and grounded. And so I'm going to invite you to borrow the characteristics of a tree when you are feeling off kilter, envisioning that you too can be more tree.
That is so interesting. So I find it fully possible, even today when I know you were going to ask me like what was most helpful for me to realign. I'm going to say I'm not totally realigned yet, and so perhaps feeling calm and grounded today maybe doesn't feel accessible yet. Mm-hmm. But I could be a tree today. I'm like, oh, I know that tree out there, and I can just start to channel that tree. And so it's also a way in towards a feeling that, as you said, is aspirational. But what comes to mind here is that's also accessible because it's outside of me. And so I don't have to change anything going on within me. And when you were talking about curiosity, I think that exercise was so helpful, not wondering why, because that gave me a little more pressure. Like, what was it? And is it, then I judge if that's okay to make you feel unsettled or not. That's sort of my brain spirals in all of that old patterning. But being curious about what's going on from the outside also separated me from what was going on. And being a tree separates me from what's going on. And those two things, that separation, I think, and reflection is really helpful.
Language, we talk about language about a lot. So when you are feeling off kilter, you yourself, like your identity is not off kilter, right? You are just feeling an aspect of being human, which just happens to be feeling off kilter, but you can separate your identity from that like very strong emotion or that strong body sensation.
I love that. And for me, when I was able to step out of it and look at it from the outside, I was like, oh, I feel like this a lot. And it actually gave me hope, because I often feel like this when I'm undergoing a shift, like something, it reminds me of 9-month-olds. The pediatrician in me is going to speak up here. Like when they are learning and growing, they don't sleep well. They're actually off kilter. They're more irritable. They have more stranger anxiety, and they're growing independence, for example. And so I think as adults, we think that doesn't happen. And yet often, perhaps, and who knows what's ahead, I'm not connected enough to know what that is, but it makes me feel better to say, oh, this is what happens to me before I get clarity, or before something shifts, or before I make a decision. This first part of it just feels unsettled. I don't even know what that is, but that is almost always my cue. And again, it's creating a narrative about it. I don't even know if it's true, but it's a helpful narrative.
Mm-hmm. And hopefully you can also include that like feeling unsettled doesn't necessarily mean something has gone wrong.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it could mean that something really good's going to happen.
That's right.
I'm not sure I believe that. I know I often say in coaching, you really have to believe it. But if I just say maybe it means that, or it's possible that this is related to that phenomenon that I have experienced before. And to be honest, when I let go of the judgment of it, it's much easier to sit in the muck of it.
Mm-hmm. In the chrysalis muck. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I'm going to ask you this question, and I'm going to rephrase it a little bit, because you just shared with us that you don't feel entirely realigned right now. So what has been the most helpful thus far to help you not fall down the stairs again, for instance?
Well, I will say falling down the stairs got my attention.
Mm-hmm.
And it actually got me to say like this is unusual. And it got me to slow down and just be kind to myself. And then I was like, well, I guess this is my call to just be kind and not try to fix this, and not try to not move through it so quickly, and slow down. And I think the other two pieces, which are a bit intertwined, is the humor. And the humor has come from talking about it, I think, with you. Like, you've been actually pretty funny about it. And when we talked about this podcast, I was like, oh, we should talk about like the funny parts of it. And that, I think, has probably helped me navigate some of the bumps, to recognize that it's funny, not funny, if that makes sense. But that lightness about it, maybe the loving amusement about the human condition. And I will note, by the way, that this will be the second podcast about me having like an off-kilter down day. Like maybe this is, but a little bit of humor about maybe that's just part of me, or part of the way I roll through the world, and accepting it rather than resisting it is definitely going to be my friend.
It's funny you said that, because I was like, oh no, she's going to be like, okay, now Ni-Cheng, we have to interview you about your off-kilter days and your down days.
Well, to be fair,
Good.
And I love bringing up old podcasts. We did interview you a few times about anxiety and parenting and stresses and challenges. And so I think we're probably, they know a lot about both of us.
And this is not a competition by any means.
No. But when the opportunity arises, I do think the processing of it, and interestingly, even having to say like, oh, well, should do a podcast on this. And what am I learning from it? That actually in and of itself was helpful, because it got me out of just the sitting in it and saying, well, what is there to learn about this? And how am I going to grow through this? And when you asked me today, I hadn't thought about this, by the way, about my behaviors, my habitual behaviors. I was like, oh, but that's actually helpho.
Yeah. In a safe way, right? It's just more out of curiosity.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, a little bit, I was like, oh, I could do better. I just should do better, but I let it go pretty fast. In the spirit of the podcast, and also like, oh yeah, that's just human, right? We are of course more reactive and short when we're not feeling right, or calm and grounded. That's why we aspire to calm and grounded. So I think that sort of humor and processing it and being open about it really helped. I think often when we feel off, we also feel really isolated, like we're the only off person in the world. And clearly that's not the case.
Yeah. Well, Jessie, thank you so much for being so open in sharing about these last few days with our listeners. And we hope, dear listener, that this was helpful and that you will share this episode amongst other helpful episodes with your loved ones to help spread the ripple effects of mindfulness. Please leave us stars and reviews. This helps other people find us as well.
Thanks so much for joining us.
We encourage you to dive into the show notes for each episode for more learnings and resources.
We also invite you to take a listen to the many other Mindful Healers podcast episodes, and please share the podcast far and wide with colleagues, friends, and family.
If our message and approach resonate with you, we would love to work with you.
When you listen to a podcast, you consume information, but when you work with us, you can actually practice and change.
We offer coaching and mindfulness experiences, talks, workshops, retreats, and more. Connect with us at themindfulhealerspodcast.com.
The content of this podcast is not medical or life advice. We invite you to participate in the mindful moments we offer at the end of most of our podcasts, but please only do so safely.
Welcome to today's mindful moment, a settling practice. Take a moment wherever you are to pause. Take a deep breath in through your nose and out through your mouth. And take a moment to notice how you feel. Notice if you feel off balance, unsettled, off kilter. Notice if you feel settled or calm or grounded. Take a moment to notice, to be aware. If you're standing, notice your feet on the floor. If you're sitting, notice your sit bones on the seat. And find your spine and stack those vertebrae one atop the other, growing tall. If it's safe for you to do so, close your eyes and come back to the breath. And notice what would feel more settling to you. Hands on thighs, hands on heart, or one hand to heart, one hand to belly. Try all three and choose the one that feels the best to you today, in this moment. Taking another moment to breathe in through your nose and out through your mouth. Noticing once again how you feel. Noticing where perhaps the sense of unsettled is, if it's with you today. Is it in your heart space? Is it in your throat? Is it in your belly? Noticing it and describing it. What does it feel like? Does it feel rattly or stressed or twangy? Is it pulsating? What color is it? Just get to know it. Notice exactly where it is. And sending it the breath. And letting it be just as it is. It's okay to be unsettled. Notice your breath and enjoy it. And notice for a moment what feels settled. Once again, perhaps your feet on the earth, perhaps your sit bones on the chair, perhaps your hands on your thighs. Perhaps your hands on your heart. Perhaps that spine, one vertebrae atop the other, feels settled. Notice if there's a way of sitting or standing that feels more settled. Breathe in and out and enjoy feeling settled. Connecting with what parts of you do feel grounded and safe. If you're standing, perhaps stand in Tadasana or mountain pose, rooting feet underneath you. If you're sitting, send roots down through your sit bone. Take in a big deep breath, sending the breath to the tips of your fingers and the tips of your toes. Long, smooth exhale. Accepting where you are right now, settled or unsettled, just as it is. Knowing that you can feel settled and unsettled all at the same time. Notice that you can feel safe, that the breath is always available to you. Remembering that this is a moment in time that shall too pass. Taking in one more luxurious, delicious, deep breath. And a wonderful exhale. Opening eyes, if they happen to be closed, let the light in slowly, no rush. Allow yourself to settle. Thank you all so much for practicing with me today. We'll see you again next week.